Rising from poverty to wealth, Danny grew up in a poor neighborhood where cramped, rundown houses lined the narrow streets under a perpetually gray sky. His family lived in a tiny house barely big enough for a worn-out bed, a scratched wooden table, and a small kitchen that was always lacking food. From a young age, Danny understood the hardship of manual labor. His father was a construction worker who came home every day drenched in sweat, his hands rough and calloused. His mother worked as a seamstress, each stitch she made carrying a silent hope for a better future for her son. Watching his parents toil endlessly, yet still struggle to afford a proper meal, Danny realized that if he didn't change his fate, he would be trapped in this cycle of poverty forever. As a boy, he took on every odd job he could find, delivering newspapers, washing cars, hauling crates at the market. The few coins he earned each day were insignificant to others, but to him, they were proof of his determination. As he grew older, Danny had no opportunity to attend college, but that didn't stop him. He took a job at a mechanical workshop, learning everything he could about machinery, sales, and business operations. He worked tirelessly, not just as a laborer, but as an observer, studying how successful people ran their businesses. After years of gaining experience and saving every penny, Danny decided to start his own venture. At first, he opened a small workshop supplying mechanical parts. The early days were brutal. No one trusted a young man with no reputation, and Danny had to personally visit every store and industrial site to introduce his products. He faced countless rejections, but each one only made him more determined. He refined his strategies, improved his products, and kept pushing forward. Over time, through sheer perseverance and hard work, Danny built a solid reputation in the industry. Customers started coming to him, orders increased, and the small workshop soon expanded into a large-scale company. The once impoverished boy now owned a thriving business empire. Meeting Helen, the woman who changed Danny's life. Danny met Helen at a business seminar. Among a crowd of ambitious entrepreneurs discussing profit margins and investments, she stood out with her graceful presence, exuding quiet confidence without seeking attention. Helen was unlike any woman Danny had met before. She wasn't drawn to wealth or status, and that intrigued him. Their first conversation happened by chance. As Helen rummaged through her bag, looking for a document, Danny, who was standing nearby, picked it up and handed it to her with a teasing smile. "Looks like you're preparing for an important presentation." Helen laughed, her eyes sparkling with intelligence. "Not exactly, I just like to be sure I'm not missing anything." From that moment, they began talking more. Helen was sharp, ambitious, yet grounded. She wasn't impressed by flashy success, but rather by the values behind it. Unlike other women who admired Danny for his wealth, Helen saw him for who he truly was, a man with dreams, struggles, and a relentless drive to succeed. Their dates weren't extravagant dinners at luxury restaurants. Instead, Danny took Helen to places that shaped his past, a small diner where he once worked as a busboy, the alley where his mother sewed late into the night. Helen listened to his stories, not with pity, but with genuine admiration. After years of dating, they decided to get married. Their wedding wasn't lavish or extravagant, just an intimate ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. Danny once thought he would have a grand wedding, but when he saw Helen in her simple white dress, he realized that what mattered wasn't the spectacle, but the life they were building together. Money changes Danny. The years of struggle were over. Danny was now a wealthy businessman with an immense fortune. He owned luxury cars, a lavish mansion with a swimming pool and sprawling gardens. His business continued to thrive, and money flowed into his accounts effortlessly. But more than anything, he felt the intoxicating power that wealth brought. At first, Danny remained cautious, investing wisely, respecting hard work, and making time for his family. But slowly, arrogance crept into his thoughts. He was no longer the poor boy scraping by. He was a success story, and the world needed to know it. He started attending elite parties, mingling with the rich and powerful. At first, these were networking events. But soon, Danny became addicted to the lifestyle. The expensive wine, the endless compliments, the feeling of being the center of attention. It all made him feel invincible, as if he had conquered the world. Helen noticed the change in him. She gently reminded him, "Danny, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You already have everything." But Danny dismissed her concerns with a smile. "I'm just enjoying life, Helen. We've worked hard. It's time to celebrate. What started as occasional nights out soon became a routine. Danny came home late, sometimes drunk. Helen would wait for him in the dimly lit living room, but their conversations became shorter and colder. She watched as her husband drifted away, but no matter how much she tried, she couldn't bring him back. Danny saw it too, but he didn't care. He was too caught up in the thrill of proving himself. Sitting at the dinner table with his family no longer brought him joy. He craved the excitement of five-star restaurants and high-stakes business deals. He spent money recklessly, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to assert his status. He bought designer suits he only wore once. He paid for entire groups of strangers at clubs just to hear them praise him. He booked extravagant hotel suites he never stayed in. Money was no longer a tool for building a future. It became a means to feed his ego. But in chasing admiration, Danny failed to see what he was losing. Helen grew distant. His two young daughters no longer ran to greet him when he came home. The house felt quieter, emptier. He left before his children woke up and returned long after they had gone to bed. He no longer knew their favorite bedtime stories, nor could he remember the last time they had dinner together. One evening, as Helen stood by the door, she looked at him with tired, disappointed eyes. "Danny, do you remember why we started?" Danny froze. He wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Wait, man, he had built everything for a better life. But was he truly living or just proving something to the world? Helen shook her head and walked away, leaving Danny standing alone in his grand, empty mansion. He had everything, yet somehow he was losing it all without even realizing it. Drowning in luxury. After achieving success, Danny was no longer the man he used to be. Money flowed effortlessly into his accounts, and he began indulging in a lavish lifestyle. At first, it was just small gatherings with business partners, a little wine, conversations about investments and market expansion. But gradually, the parties became more extravagant, stretching into the early morning hours, filled with expensive liquor, booming music, and people constantly flattering him. Danny was intoxicated by the admiration. At high-end nightclubs, he was treated like royalty. The staff recognized him from a distance, immediately preparing VIP tables with bottles of imported champagne, each worth more than a month's salary for an average worker. Beautiful women surrounded him, whispering sweet words, showering him with admiration simply because he could pull out his wallet and pay exorbitant bills without a second thought. At first, Helen remained patient. She reminded him that the company needed his attention, that his employees were waiting for his decisions. But Danny merely waved her off. "Jacob's got it under control. The company is doing fine, don't worry." But that wasn't the reality. Neglecting work and responsibilities. The days when Danny was deeply involved in running his company were long gone. He started missing important meetings, ignoring urgent emails from his management team. When his assistants sought him out, they were often met with the same response. "Mr. Carter is busy." But everyone knew exactly what he was busy with. Wild parties that lasted till dawn, expensive gambling trips to Las Vegas, and luxury resort getaways. Helen tried to reason with him. "Danny, the company still needs you. You worked so hard to build it. You can't just abandon it like this." But Danny no longer listened. "I'm not abandoning anything. Jacob is handling things just fine, and besides, don't you see? We're finally living the life I always dreamed of." He stopped caring about financial reports, ignored signs that the company was struggling. Important business trips were canceled because he was too exhausted from nights of partying. Major contracts were lost to competitors because Danny was no longer the sharp, decisive businessman he once was. Meanwhile, Jacob, his trusted friend, was gaining more and more control over the company. And as greed took root, Jacob realized something crucial. Danny was no longer a leader. He was just a man lost in his own indulgences, completely unaware that his empire was crumbling beneath him. The bitter betrayal. One fateful day, while enjoying yet another luxury vacation on a private beach, Danny received an urgent call from his assistant. "We have a huge problem, Danny. The company, it looks like our internal information has been leaked." At first, Danny didn't think much of it, but when he returned to the office, the situation was far worse than he had imagined. A major competitor had somehow obtained the company's business plans, critical contracts had been sabotaged, and stock prices were plummeting uncontrollably. Danny immediately called for an emergency meeting. But when he entered the boardroom, the one person missing was Jacob. "Where's Jacob?" Danny demanded, but no one answered. A growing sense of dread settled in his chest. When his assistant hesitantly handed him a folder, Danny flipped through the documents, his hands trembling. The papers revealed everything. Jacob had sold the company's secrets to a rival firm in exchange for an enormous payout and had disappeared without a trace. Danny's fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A wave of fury and disbelief washed over him. The man he trusted the most had stabbed him in the back, a collapse beyond saving. In a desperate attempt to fix things, Danny refused to accept that his company was on the brink of ruin. He threw himself into high-risk investments, pouring money into stocks and cryptocurrency, hoping for a miraculous turnaround. But he wasn't an experienced investor. Every decision was made in haste, driven by panic rather than strategy. He gambled everything on luck, but luck had abandoned him. Each passing day, the losses grew. The assets he once owned, his luxurious mansion, his sports cars, even his company, were sold off one by one to pay off debts. But the financial black hole was too deep. Nothing could fill it. Within months, Danny lost everything. His fortune vanished, his company collapsed, and his reputation was in shambles. The people who once surrounded him, raising their glasses in lavish parties, now avoided him. No one wanted to be associated with a fallen man. Danny began to see the harsh truth. Loyalty was never permanent. When the money disappeared, so did the people who once called him their friend. Helen's departure. Danny knew he had hurt his family, but he still believed Helen would stay, as she always had. But one evening, as he walked into what was once their home, now emptier than ever, he found Helen packing her bags. "What are you doing?" Danny asked, his voice weaker than he had ever heard it. Helen paused, looking at him with sadness and finality. "Danny, I tried. I really tried, but you're not the man I fell in love with anymore." Danny stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "You changed. You let yourself be consumed by that illusion, and you stopped seeing what really mattered. You lost everything, and now I can't stay either." Desperation overwhelmed him as he watched Helen drag her suitcase toward the door. She wasn't taking much, just her clothes and a few personal belongings. But the most painful part was that their 2 daughters were staying behind. Danny looked at his children, their innocent eyes filled with confusion. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew their mother was leaving. "Helen, please!" Danny's voice broke. Helen just shook her head before stepping out the door without another word. The door slammed shut behind her, and Danny stood there in what used to be their home, now filled with nothing but a deafening silence. He had lost everything. Alone and at rock bottom. The glorious days were now a distant past. Danny was left with nothing but empty hands and a mountain of debt crushing him. His lavish lifestyle had disappeared, replaced by endless days filled with anxiety and despair. Danny tried to maintain a normal life for his 2 daughters, but the harsh reality could no longer be hidden. One afternoon, on the way home from picking them up from school, the girls excitedly ran toward an ice cream cart, their eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Daddy, can we have some ice cream?" Danny froze. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for any loose change. What he found wasn't enough, not even for a single cone. A numb sensation spread through his body, a suffocating shame tightening around his heart. An ice cream cone, something he used to buy for them without a second thought, had now become a luxury he couldn't afford. His hands trembled. His palms were sweaty. He couldn't let his daughters see his helplessness. But no matter how hard he tried to suppress it, the feeling of failure surged through him, like a knife carving deep into his pride. "Daddy?" Danny forced a smile, keeping his voice as steady as possible. "It's a bit chilly today. How about we get some tomorrow?" The girls hesitated for a moment, then silently nodded. No whining, no complaining, just a simple nod. And that was what hurt Danny the most. They understood too much. They were too well behaved. The older one gently took her sister's hand and whispered, "It's okay, we can have it another day." Danny stood frozen. They should have been carefree, like other kids their age, playfully insisting on ice cream. But instead, they chose silence and acceptance, because they knew their father had no money. A wave of failure crashed over Danny's mind. He had once been a millionaire, holding more money than most people could dream of in a lifetime. And yet now he couldn't even buy a simple ice cream cone for his daughters. He was a failure, a useless man, a father who couldn't provide. He held their little hands tightly, the pain in his chest making it hard to breathe. His heavy footsteps dragged him home, But there was only one thought in his mind. He couldn't go on like this. Asking for help from his family. That night, after tucking his daughters into bed, Danny sat alone in a battered chair in his empty apartment. Around him were unpaid bills, bare walls, and the remnants of a life that was crumbling apart. He buried his face in his hands, utterly drained, physically, emotionally, mentally. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, but his pride wouldn't allow him to return to his parents in disgrace. He had promised them he would succeed, that they would be proud of him. And now he had nothing to show but shame and failure. But the image of his daughters silently nodding, choosing to go without ice cream, haunted him. They didn't deserve this. They needed a better life, a father who could care for them. And so, in the dead of night, Danny picked up the phone, his hands shaking as he dialed his mother's number. Her voice was warm, just as he remembered. "Danny, it's late. Is everything okay?" Danny opened his mouth, but the words didn't come immediately. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in years, tears welled up and fell down his face. "Mom, I failed." There was a moment of silence on the other end before she softly said, "Come home, Danny. Let the girls stay with us. You need to start over, rebuild everything. They need a father who can take care of them." Danny bit his lip, trying to hold back the sobs. But he knew she was right. He had no other choice. If he wanted to rise again, he had to first accept that he had fallen. Finally, he nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I'll come home." She didn't ask any more questions, just gently reassured him. "Everything will be okay, my son." Danny wasn't sure if that was true, but at least for now, he wasn't alone anymore. Starting over from nothing, he went back to work, not as a businessman, but as a manual laborer, just like in his childhood. Under the scorching sun, he lifted heavy loads, stacked crates, and worked tirelessly. The task that once felt familiar now drained him to the bone. People recognized him. Danny Carter, the former millionaire playboy, now just another laborer. "Look who it is! Isn't that Mr. Carter, the big shot? Didn't he used to buy drinks for everyone at the bar? Now he can't even afford a bottle of water." From a millionaire to a warehouse grunt. Serves him right. Danny clenched his jaw, his hands trembling with frustration. Rage burned inside him, but he had no right to fight back. He was powerless. He was nobody now. He kept his head down, ignoring the jeers, ignoring the judgmental stares. The only thing he could do was keep working, lifting, carrying, enduring. Because now he had no choice but to swallow his pride and move forward. Turning point. The night of awakening. One night, after an exhausting day of work, Danny dragged himself down an empty street, his body so drained that every step felt heavier than the last. His worn-out work clothes were covered in dust. His calloused hands throbbed from hours of hauling heavy loads. His stomach growled, but he only had a few coins left in his pocket. Looking around, his eyes landed on a hot dog stand by the roadside, steam rising into the still night air. Danny approached, pulling out his last few coins and placing them on the counter. The vendor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a rough, unshaven face, looked at him with a calm yet profound gaze, as if he had seen many weary souls stop by his cart before. "Long day, huh?" the man asked, his deep voice carrying warmth but not pity. Danny hesitated. It had been a long time since someone had asked him such a simple question. At first, he merely nodded, unwilling to engage. He didn't need anyone's pity. But when his eyes met the man's, he saw something different. Not judgment, not condescension, but understanding. The kind of understanding that only comes from someone who has known loss, who has seen his own life crumble. The man quietly placed a warm hot dog in Danny's hands, not rushing him to pay. He pulled out a chair, his gaze still steady and filled with empathy. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders," he said slowly, adjusting the faded apron around his waist. "I used to be the same." Danny furrowed his brow slightly, but sat down nonetheless. Not because he wanted to talk, but because his legs were too exhausted to stand any longer. Patrick, that was his name, was not a man who had once been rich or famous. He didn't speak of great achievements or missed opportunities. He simply spoke of a life that had been ordinary. A man who had once worked a stable job, had a small family, and lived in quiet contentment until life took away everything he held dear. "I was never someone important, never someone great," Patrick chuckled softly, his gaze drifting into the distance. "I was just an ordinary man. I had a steady arm, a home, a wife who always waited for me at the dinner table. I thought that was enough. But sometimes life doesn't let you keep what you cherish. Danny sat in silence, listening as Patrick's words settled deep within him. There was no grand wisdom, no dramatic lesson, just simple words carrying the weight of a life truly lived. Then I lost my job. My wife fell ill. The money ran out. One day I came home and there was nothing left. Patrick spoke as if it were just another fact, but Danny could hear the quiet sorrow beneath his voice. I thought my life had ended that day. Patrick looked at Danny, his eyes no longer filled with sadness, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who had made peace with his past. But you know what? The next morning the sun still rose. I was still here and I had to keep moving forward. Danny lowered his head, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time he realized he wasn't alone in his loss. There were others who had lost everything, yet they still stood. They didn't need riches, they didn't need applause. They simply continued to live. He didn't know why, but Patrick's words brought him a strange sense of peace. How long had it been since he truly listened to someone? Since he let someone truly listen to him? When Patrick finished speaking, Danny unknowingly clenched the hot dog in his hand. A wave of emotion surged within him, an unbearable tightness in his chest, an overwhelming urge to speak. And for the first time in months, he opened up. He spoke of everything, from the glorious days of wealth, to the times he let arrogance consume him, to the mistakes, the betrayals, and the worst moment of his life when he couldn't even afford to buy his daughter an ice cream cone. As he spoke, silent tears began to roll down his cheeks, not because he wanted pity, but because he regretted everything. He regretted losing himself, allowing greed and vanity to lead him astray. A man's tears do not fall easily, especially not for pain. Danny wasn't crying because he was weak. He was crying because he was finally strong enough to face himself. Patrick did not interrupt, nor did he offer empty reassurances. He simply listened, his eyes as steady as still water. When Danny finally stopped speaking, Patrick gave him a small, knowing smile, not one of pity, but of understanding. He patted Danny's shoulder lightly and said, "You're still here, aren't you? That means it's not over yet." Danny looked at Patrick, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him. Yes, he was still here. That meant he still had a chance to change. Patrick's words awakened something deep inside Danny. That night, as he lay in his shabby rented room, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened, his mistakes, the opportunities he had squandered. But more than anything, he thought of his two daughters, his little angels who had suffered because of his downfall. He had spent too long blaming life, blaming those who betrayed him, blaming the people who abandoned him when he lost everything. But now he saw a painful truth. He was the one responsible for his own destruction. And if he wanted to change, it had to start with himself. Determination to start over. The next morning, Danny walked into the construction site, not with resentment, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer saw himself as a failure, nor did he let the mocking words of his coworkers affect him. He accepted reality. He was no longer a millionaire, but he was still a man, and he could rebuild his life. He worked not just to earn money, but to rebuild himself. He learned patience, humility, and most importantly, how to avoid repeating his past mistakes. Instead of chasing quick riches, he began educating himself on proper business management, safe investments, and financial discipline. Each night after work, instead of succumbing to exhaustion, he went to the library, reading books on business and the stories of successful entrepreneurs. He no longer sought validation from others, but focused on improving himself. As time passed, his relentless efforts bore fruit. He saved every penny, carefully managing his expenses. Then one day, with the small amount he had managed to save, he opened a modest eatery, not luxurious, but steady and sustainable. This time, he built not on fleeting ambitions, but on a foundation of hard work and true understanding. Becoming a better father. But the most important transformation wasn't in his work or finances. It was in how he rediscovered the true meaning of life. Danny was no longer the man who prioritized parties over family. He no longer chased after wealth at the expense of those who truly mattered. Now every morning he prepared breakfast for his daughters, held their hands on the way to school. Every evening, instead of extravagant dinners and high-end restaurants, he sat with them, listening to their stories, teaching them the importance of gratitude and perseverance. He realized that a father doesn't need to be wealthy, he just needs to be present, to love and protect his children. A beautiful ending and a life lesson. One evening after closing his eatery, Danny found himself thinking about the man who had changed his life. He decided to return to the street where Patrick had once sold hot dogs. But when he arrived, the cart was gone. Patrick had retired and was no longer there. Danny stood in silence, feeling both a sense of loss and deep gratitude. The man might have moved on, but his words remained, like a guiding light that had helped Danny find his way back to himself. Looking up at the starry sky, Danny took a deep breath and smiled. I'm still standing. He was no longer the Danny of the past, the man blinded by vanity and excess. He was a new man, stronger, wiser, and most importantly, a better father. And the lesson he learned after everything was this: success is not about money or status, but about how we rise after we fall. Everything can be lost, but true failure only happens when we give up on ourselves. As long as we're still standing, we can always start again.